Michael, I want to start with this incredible piece that tells the whole story, as you said, from these brand new memoirs that have come out that each have a little piece of what is extraordinary, not just in the Trump story, but in the history of White House chiefs of staff. Talk about your reporting.
Well, thanks for having me. Mark Meadows, he is a central figure in this investigation. He's been cited for contempt of Congress. Justice Department is investigating whether to press charges on that. So while he turned over thousands of text messages that I reference in this story, there's a lot more that he would know. His testimony would be crucial to this investigation. So while the committee's talked to hundreds of witnesses, they really want to talk to Mark Meadows. He was often one of the few people or alone with President Trump in the room. So he has a valuable story to tell, and he's so far declined to tell that after deciding not to cooperate in December. And what I try to do here is put together essentially a documentary, a narrative, putting together a lot of information that's been out there and recent information, looking at all the court filings, the memoirs, as you mentioned. For example, just 2 weeks ago in a court filing, the committee said that Meadows had said on the morning of January 6th, in response to a member of Congress who had said Pence could essentially not certify the electors from certain states, and Meadows wrote back on the morning of January 6th, I have pushed this. He didn't think it would happen, but I thought that was something really important to include because that's, in his own words, he was more than an observer. According to all of these documents and the story that we write, he was a central player in these events.
Michael, what swirls around as one of these questions around Donald Trump's culpability will be what he thought to be true. And people who talked to Donald Trump right after the election suggest that he knew he'd lost and it was all a grift to raise money for extensive legal battles. That frame seems to be shifting, especially if you look at some of Donald Trump's recent rally performances. What does your reporting suggest Mark Meadows thought? Did Mark Meadows believe all of this stuff? I mean, did he really not believe Bill Barr when Bill Barr said, hey, Mark, I looked at this. There's no evidence of systemic fraud?
Well, it's a great question. In his memoir, which he called The Chief's Chief, Mark Meadows wrote that he knew that the most important job that he had as chief of staff was to tell President Trump when he was wrong. I asked a lot of White House officials, former officials, are they ever aware of him doing that? They didn't know of any. Perhaps it happened in a one-on-one session. What I report pretty significantly in this story is that even after December 14th, when the states certified their electors, which would then be going to Congress on January 6th, Mark Meadows met at the White House. He met it with Trump, members of Congress who wanted to push this. And then he tweeted that, they were still looking into these allegations of voter fraud. This was after the December 14th phone call between Mitch McConnell, where he congratulated Joe Biden on victory. So he was pushing this even after, that very significant date. And then I document how he was pushing the Justice Department officials, the acting attorney general and others, to look into claims, even in late December, even in early January. So he was playing a very central role. Now, was he conveying at every point what Trump wanted him to do? That's something that he would have to answer if he was on your show. But clearly, he was doing this. He was putting it out on Twitter. He was putting it in emails that we now have access to. He was saying it in text messages that, thanks to court filings as recent as 2 weeks ago, we now know about.
So, Luke Broadwater, I know for this reporting, Michael reached out to Meadows and he reached out to Terwilliger with some questions and comments, and they weren't particularly forthcoming. But by far, some of the most valuable evidence that is at least public-facing that the 1-6 committee is in possession of is the Mark Meadows body of text messages. Have you been able to piece together what happens between Terwilliger's document production of all of that text messaging from the president's son, the president's closest media allies, people like Sean Hannity, and then conduct that now has him facing criminal contempt of Congress charges?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question why he initially cooperates and then stops, right? Now, one thing I think that's important to note about that is he doesn't turn over all his text messages. Many of the text messages that have come out have included, explosive material that we've written about, that the Post has written about, that you've talked about on this show. But there's a lot that he held back, right? And so that is going to be the material that Mark Meadows thought was the most sensitive, that he thought was protected by executive privilege. And so he never gives that to the committee in the first place. And what Mark Meadows and his attorney were trying to do was give the committee enough material to keep them happy, to avoid a contempt of Congress charge, and at the same time keep President Trump happy by not giving them too much. Now, then Meadows' book comes out. There's some reporting that Donald Trump was displeased that he heard that Mark Meadows was cooperating or that he was promoting this book. And then all of a sudden, he stops cooperating. He refuses to give any more information to the committee. He refuses to come in and sit for an interview as he had promised to do. I talked with some committee members who believe it was pressure from Donald Trump that got him to stop doing that. If you talk to Meadows' attorney, they said they cooperated up to an extent, but could not go any further. I'm not sure exactly who to believe here, but we know there is still more material that Mark Meadows has that he has not given this committee.